A carrier strike group clears San Diego Harbor. The lead ship displaces more than 100,000 tons. Its flight deck stretches nearly 1,000 feet. The electromagnetic catapults on her bow can hurl a loaded F/A-18 Super Hornet from 0 to flight speed in under 3 seconds. By any measure, USS Gerald R. Ford is the most capable aircraft carrier ever put to sea. And in June 2026, the United States Navy is formally questioning whether it should keep building them. That is the loop. The fleet is sailing these ships hard, deploying them, operating them, running flight operations around the clock, while simultaneously auditing whether the most expensive version of the carrier is worth the premium over the proven one. You do not interrogate your crown jewel mid-deployment without a reason. So what is the reason? The answer is not simple. It is a stack of engineering trade-offs, budget math, and a missile threat sitting in the Western Pacific that changes the economics of every decision the Navy makes. We are going to work through each layer. But the core question underneath all of it is this: when a single hull costs $13 billion and an adversary's counterweapon costs a fraction of that, does the most expensive version of the ship buy you enough extra capability to justify the gap? Stay with us. Because the answer the review lands on is not what most people expect. To understand why June 2026 matters, you need to go back about 15 years, to the decision that produced the Gerald R. Ford class in the first place. The United States has operated nuclear-powered supercarriers since USS Enterprise commissioned in 1961. For decades, the workhorse was the Nimitz class. 10 ships, each displacing roughly 100,000 tons, each carrying an air wing of 70 to 80 aircraft, each powered by 2 nuclear reactors. The Nimitz design was refined across multiple decades of construction, from USS Nimitz herself in 1975 all the way to USS George H.W. Bush, which commissioned in 2009. By that point, the class was mature, well understood, and reliable. The Navy knew exactly what it was getting. But the Nimitz design was also aging. Its steam catapult system, the C-13, dated to technology developed in the 1950s. Steam catapults work by storing high-pressure steam in massive accumulators below deck, then releasing it through a piston track to accelerate aircraft. The system is mechanically complex, maintenance-intensive, and not easily adjustable for different aircraft weights. As carrier air wings evolved toward heavier strike aircraft and the potential future integration of unmanned systems, Navy planners began looking for something better. The answer was EMALS, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. Instead of steam, EMALS uses a linear induction motor driven by stored electrical energy, essentially a very large and very fast version of the same physics that runs a railgun or a maglev train. The theoretical advantages were real. Smoother acceleration that reduces airframe stress, adjustable energy levels tunable to each aircraft's weight, lower long-run maintenance burden, and faster potential cycle rates. On paper, EMALS was not just an upgrade. It was a generational leap. The ship designed around EMALS became the Gerald R. Ford class. The lead ship, USS Gerald R. Ford herself was authorized in 2001, laid down in 2009, launched in 2013, and commissioned in July 2017. The second ship, USS John F. Kennedy, commissioned in 2024. A third, USS Enterprise, the second carrier to carry that name, is under construction at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. The program was designed to produce a carrier markedly superior to the Nimitz class. More capable, more sortie efficient, more ready for the air wars of the mid-21st century. The price for all of that ambition is the number at the center of this story. The Gerald R. Ford herself cost approximately $13 billion in then-year dollars by the time construction and outfitting were complete. A Nimitz-class carrier, in comparable then-year dollars, came in at roughly $8.5 billion. That is a gap of more than $4 billion per hull for what is supposed to be a better ship. Whether it actually is better, and whether that improvement is worth $4 billion extra dollars per unit, is exactly what the June 2026 review is examining. The starting point for any honest assessment of the Ford class is EMALS, because EMALS is the centerpiece of the entire upgrade rationale. If electromagnetic launch delivers on its promise, a significant portion of that cost premium is justified. If it does not, the math gets uncomfortable very quickly. The early service history of USS Gerald R. Ford was, to put it plainly, difficult. The ship deployed years later than originally planned, held back in part by technical problems with EMALS and the associated Advanced Arresting Gear System, known as AAG, which uses a similar electromagnetic principle for recovering aircraft. During initial testing and early operations, both systems recorded reliability figures well below what the Navy needed for sustained combat operations. Reliability in aviation is typically measured in mean time between failures, or MTBF. How many cycles you can expect to complete before a system fails and requires intervention. The original threshold for EMALS was 400 launches between critical failures. Early operational data fell short of that figure, sometimes significantly. The AAG system had comparable difficulties. When you are running flight operations on a carrier, a catapult failure does not just stop one launch. It can cascade across the entire flight schedule, disrupting everything queued behind it. The Navy and the contractor, General Atomics, worked through the problems across several years of refinement. By the time Ford completed her first full deployment in 2023, the reliability numbers had improved substantially. Later data from continued operations showed EMALS reaching and in some cases exceeding 400 launches per critical failure under real-world conditions. The AAG showed similar improvement. By 2025, the system was performing closer to what was originally specified. Here is the thing about that, though. And this is one of those details that stuck with me when I went through the operational reports. The improvement came after years of at-sea troubleshooting, crew adaptation, and maintenance refinements that were not anticipated in the original program schedule. The Ford class worked through its teething problems. But working through them cost time, operational availability, and money in maintenance and modifications that were not budgeted when the program was sold to Congress. The question the June 2026 review is really asking is whether the system, even at its current improved reliability, delivers enough additional Sortie generation capability over a steam catapult system to justify the cost differential, not just in hull price, but in life cycle maintenance. Put yourself in the position of a Navy planner for a second. You have a carrier that is unambiguously more capable in some dimensions. It launches aircraft with less airframe stress. It can theoretically cycle aircraft faster. It is more flexible for future unmanned aircraft integration. But it cost $4 billion more per hull. And for the first several years of its life, it was less operationally available than the proven alternative. What weight do you give each of those factors when you are deciding where to spend the next $20 billion in shipbuilding budget? The Sortie generation rate question deserves its own layer of attention because it is the operational core of the Ford class's entire value proposition. A carrier's combat effectiveness is not just about how many aircraft it carries. It is about how many sorties per day it can generate, how quickly it can turn aircraft around, rearm them, refuel them, and put them back in the air. In high-intensity conflict, the difference between 40 sorties a day and 160 sorties a day is the difference between a limited presence and genuine air dominance over a large area of ocean and coast. The Nimitz class, with its C-13 steam catapults and conventional arresting gear, can generate roughly 120 sustained sorties per day under good conditions, with surge capacity higher than that for short periods. The Ford class was designed to reach 160 sustained sorties per day, a 33% improvement, driven largely by EMALS' faster potential cycle rate and a redesigned flight deck layout that reduces the distance aircraft travel between the hangar, the weapons elevator, and the catapult track. The redesigned weapons elevators are themselves a significant piece of this. The Ford class replaced the old deck edge elevators used on Nimitz-class ships with advanced weapons elevators, 11 of them, that move ordnance faster and with less manpower. In theory, this means aircraft can be rearmed more quickly, which directly improves sortie rate. In practice, those weapons elevators were another source of early problems. Several experienced certification delays and reliability issues during Ford's initial service period, contributing to the operational availability shortfalls that defined her early years. By 2024 and 2025, the elevator situation had largely been resolved, and the Navy was seeing sortie generation numbers that, while not consistently hitting the 160 target under all conditions, were meaningfully higher than comparable Nimitz-class operations. The obstacle here is that meaningfully higher and 33% higher are not the same thing. And in a $13 billion program, the gap between the theoretical improvement and the demonstrated improvement matters enormously for the cost-benefit calculation. What strikes me most about this particular piece of the story is not the reliability failures themselves. Complex new systems almost always have early problems. What strikes me is that the 33% sortie rate improvement was, from the beginning, the primary operational justification for the cost premium. If that improvement delivers fully and consistently, the Ford class is probably worth the money, at least on operational terms. If it delivers partially, you are paying a $4 billion premium for maybe a 15 to 20% improvement, and suddenly the math looks very different. Now we need to bring in the other side of the ledger, because the EMALS reliability story, as complicated as it is only half of what is driving the June 2026 review. The other half is a missile, the DF-21D, the DF-26. These are the weapons that Chinese military planners designate as carrier killers. Anti-ship ballistic missiles designed to fly hundreds of miles, reach the apex of a ballistic arc, and then descend at hypersonic speeds onto a moving target. The DF-21D has a reported range of roughly 1,500 kilometres. The DF-26 extends that to perhaps 4,000 kilometres. A weapon that, if the operational claims are accurate, can threaten carrier strike groups operating well into the Western Pacific, potentially as far as Guam. The economics of this threat are the part that keeps Navy planners awake. A DF-26 missile costs, by most open source estimates, somewhere in the range of $5 to $15 million per unit. A rough figure with real uncertainty, but in that order of magnitude. The target it is designed to hold at risk costs $13 billion. That is an asymmetry of somewhere between 800 to 1 and 2,000 to 1, depending on whose numbers you use. Here is the take that will probably get some pushback. That asymmetry alone does not make the carrier obsolete, but it absolutely changes what you can responsibly ask a single $13 billion hull to do. A Nimitz-class carrier at $8.5 billion represents a somewhat smaller asymmetry with the same missile. Not dramatically different, but if you are thinking about risk across an entire fleet, the difference between paying $8.5 billion per hull and paying $13 billion per hull matters when you are considering how many hulls you can afford to put in contested waters. What naval planners call the carrier's risk radius, the zone within which it can operate without accepting unacceptable threat exposure, has been compressed by these weapons. In the Cold War, carriers operated in relatively open ocean, and the primary threats were submarines and aircraft, both of which required getting relatively close to the carrier group before engaging. An anti-ship ballistic missile changes that calculation entirely. It can be fired from a land-based launcher, hundreds or thousands of miles from the carrier's operating area, by forces that never come within range of the carrier's defensive systems. The carrier strike group has significant defensive depth. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system and SM-6 interceptor missiles, cruisers, submarines running interference, and the carrier's own F/A-18, Super Hornet and F-35C aircraft providing the outer defensive ring. But intercepting a hypersonic descent anti-ship ballistic missile is one of the hardest problems in modern naval warfare. The SM-6 has a terminal ballistic missile defense capability, and the Navy has been working hard to improve that intercept record. It is not zero, but it is also not a guarantee. The question the June 2026 review is sitting with is not whether the carrier is survivable. The Navy believes it is, with the right support architecture. The question is whether the most expensive version of the carrier adds enough extra capability in the DF-26 threat environment to justify the premium, or whether that $4 billion difference per hull is better spent on more Arleigh Burke destroyers, more SM-6 interceptors, or more distributed platforms that complicate any adversary's targeting problem. Let us put some harder numbers on the broader picture, because the carrier question does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a shipbuilding competition that has been running for more than a decade, and that is being won, in terms of raw numbers, by one side in a way that is not comfortable to acknowledge. China's naval construction program is producing surface combatants at a rate that has no peacetime precedent in modern history. The People's Liberation Army Navy commissioned more major surface warships across the 2015 to 2025 period than most Western navies have in their entire current inventory. The Type 055 destroyer, a ship that rivals or exceeds the Arleigh Burke class in displacement and capability by several metrics, has entered service in numbers that would have seemed improbable 15 years ago. China now operates 3 aircraft carriers: the Liaoning, the Shandong, and the Fujian. The Type 003, which commissioned in 2024 and notably uses its own electromagnetic catapult system, making it the second nation in history to field that technology on a carrier. A 4th hull is reportedly under construction. Chinese carrier aviation is less mature than American carrier aviation. That is a meaningful gap, but the trajectory is clear. The US Navy, by contrast, is working against a shipbuilding industrial base that has faced genuine capacity constraints. The single shipyard capable of building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Newport News Shipbuilding, now Haiti, is running at the edge of its capacity. Submarine construction has experienced delays. The combination of a more expensive Ford-class carrier and a constrained production capacity means that the rate at which the US can recapitalize its carrier force is limited. The Navy currently operates 11 nuclear-powered carriers. That number has been relatively stable for years, maintained as policy. But maintaining 11 carriers when hull retirements are approaching and new construction is expensive and slow creates budget pressure that feeds directly into the review question. Is the $13 billion Ford-class hull the right investment to keep the number at 11, or should budget flexibility drive a different choice? This is where the review's actual framing becomes important, and where the June 2026 document diverges from how this story has mostly been covered in the defense press. The review is not, according to multiple accounts of its contents, recommending that the Ford class be cancelled. It is not arguing that the class is a failed program. It is asking a more precise question. Given the cost differential between a Ford-class hull and a Nimitz-class hull, and given the threat environment in the Western Pacific, does the additional capability of the Ford class justify the premium across the fleet as a whole? That is a different question than does the Ford class work. It works. It is becoming more reliable. Its electromagnetic systems are maturing. It will almost certainly reach its design sortie rate in sustained operations. The question is about value per dollar in a specific strategic context, and that context has some features that complicate the Ford class premium. A carrier operating in the Western Pacific against a mature anti-ship ballistic missile threat cannot operate as close to the adversary's coast as carriers operated in earlier conflicts. The F/A-18 Super Hornet, even with external tanks, has a combat radius of roughly 700 nautical miles. The F-35C extends that somewhat, but the physics of fuel and weapons load create hard limits. If the carrier has to operate from a greater standoff distance to reduce its risk exposure, the reach of its aircraft becomes the binding constraint, not the sortie rate. In that environment, the 160 sorties per day that EMALS enables may be less decisive than originally envisioned, because the aircraft's combat radius, not the launch rate, is limiting what the carrier can actually do. A Nimitz-class carrier generating 120 sorties per day from the same standoff position is reaching the same targets with the same aircraft. The gap between the two sortie rates matters less if the aircraft cannot close the remaining distance to the target regardless. This does not make EMALS worthless. It matters for contested air superiority over the carrier itself, for anti-submarine warfare sorties, for logistical support operations. But for the deep strike mission against hardened targets on a sophisticated adversary's coast, the math does not favour paying $4 billion per hull for a 33% better launch rate if the launch rate is not actually the constraint. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. The Navy commissioned this review while simultaneously deploying Ford-class carriers on operations that validate exactly the skills those ships will need in any future conflict. The strike group that cleared San Diego in June 2026 is not sitting at the pier while the budget debate happens in Washington. It is running flight operations, integrating with allied forces, exercising the command and control networks that a major fleet engagement would require. The review and the deployment are happening in parallel because the Navy has to do both. It cannot pause operations to wait for budget clarity, and it cannot avoid the budget question because the next hull decision is approaching. The economic layer underneath all of this is where the numbers become genuinely difficult. The United States defense budget is large, around $850 billion in fiscal year 2026, of which the Navy's share is somewhere in the range of $250 to $270 billion. That sounds like enough money to do almost anything. In practice, it is not, because naval hardware is extraordinarily expensive, and the Navy is trying to recapitalize across multiple capability areas simultaneously. Submarines, surface combatants, carrier aviation, logistics, ships, undersea systems, unmanned platforms. The Virginia-class submarine program, which produces the Navy's primary fast attack submarines, has been running behind its 2-per-year production target due to labor and supply chain constraints at the 2 yards that build them. Electric Boat in Connecticut and Newport News in Virginia. Block V Virginia-class boats are priced at roughly $3.5 billion each. A Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine. The SSBN that carries the nuclear deterrent to sea costs approximately $9 billion per hull. These programs compete for the same skilled labor, the same specialized materials, and the same shipyard capacity as the Ford-class carrier. In that environment, every dollar spent on the Ford-class premium over a Nimitz-class hull is a dollar not available for a Virginia-class submarine, or for additional Arleigh Burke destroyers, or for the SM-6 interceptor stockpile that would need to be very deep to sustain a high-intensity conflict in the Western Pacific. The opportunity cost of each carrier-class decision is measured not just in billions of dollars, but in specific capabilities that either exist or do not exist when the shooting starts. The DF-26's cost asymmetry comes back here in a different form. If a Chinese missile salvo targets a carrier strike group and the intercept is attempted by SM-6 missiles costing roughly $4 million each, a volley of 20 missiles on the incoming side costs somewhere between $100 million and $300 million. The defensive intercept of that volley, if it requires 10 to 15 SM-6S, costs $40 to $60 million. More manageable, but still a real expenditure. Now run that arithmetic across weeks of high-intensity operations and consider how deep the SM-6 stockpile would need to be. The missile inventory problem is not academic. It is a direct constraint on how long a carrier strike group can sustain defensive operations. Most people assume that the United States simply outspends any adversary on defense, and that raw budget size determines the outcome of any long-duration competition. the evidence does not entirely support that assumption. Chinese shipbuilding costs are substantially lower than American costs for comparable tonnage, partly due to labour costs, partly due to state subsidisation of the industrial base, and partly due to different material standards and production efficiencies. A Type 055 destroyer costs the Chinese government somewhere between $900 million and $1.5 billion by most estimates. An Arleigh Burke Flight 3 costs around $2.5 billion. The capability gap is real and meaningful, but the cost ratio means China can build more hulls per defence yuan than the US can per defence dollar. So we come to the turn. The review's central finding, as it has been reported, is not a condemnation of the Ford class. It is more subtle than that, and in some ways more consequential. The review reportedly raises the question of whether the Navy should plan for the carrier immediately following USS Enterprise. The fourth Ford-class hull, currently designated CVN-82, to be built to a modified standard that captures the key improvements of the Ford class, particularly EMALS and AAG, and the improved weapons handling system, while potentially reducing some of the higher cost elements that have not yet delivered their full value. This is sometimes described as a Ford derivative approach rather than a full next-generation design. The alternative that has circulated in defence planning discussions is returning to something closer to the Nimitz design philosophy: simpler, cheaper, faster to build, while investing the saved funds in the distributed lethality architecture. More destroyers, more submarines, more long-range strike weapons like the Tomahawk Block V with its anti-ship capability, and more unmanned systems that can extend the carrier's reach without putting a $13 billion hull at risk. Neither option is obviously correct. This is what the review actually reveals, and it is the honest answer to the loop we opened with. The Navy is interrogating the Ford-class mid-deployment, not because it has failed, but because the strategic environment has changed in ways that make the original cost-benefit calculation look different than it did when the program was designed. In the 1990s and early 2000s, when the Gerald Ford-class was conceived, the primary threat the carrier faced in the Pacific was a Chinese Navy that was growing but not yet capable of the kind of sustained anti-access operation that the DF-26 now represents. The carrier could operate with less standoff. Its aircraft's reach was less constrained by threat geometry, and the sortie rate premium of EMALS was more directly relevant to the most likely combat scenarios. That strategic context produced a rational decision to build the most capable carrier ever conceived. The world in June 2026 is different. The DF-26 is real, deployed, and tested. The Type 003 Fujian carrier is operational. The planned submarine force has grown. The Western Pacific is a more contested space than the program designers assumed. And the Navy is working through what that means for how it should allocate the next several decades of shipbuilding budget. Here is what this tells us about the broader competition. The United States is not losing the carrier competition. It has a mature, experienced carrier force with a depth of knowledge. In aircraft, in tactics, in carrier strike group coordination, in night operations, in all-weather flight. That took decades to build, and that China has not yet replicated. That is a real advantage. But advantages built on expensive platforms face a specific kind of erosion when an adversary finds a cheap and scalable way to threaten those platforms from a distance. The review is the Navy's attempt to get ahead of that erosion before it becomes a crisis. The crew dimension of this story deserves attention, because it is easy to talk about platforms and miss the human system that makes them work. A Ford-class carrier deploys with a crew of approximately 2,500 to 3,000 sailors on the ship itself, plus the air wing, another 2,000 to 2,500 personnel, plus the staff of the carrier strike group commander. Call it 5,000 to 6,000 people whose professional lives revolve around one hull. Training that crew, maintaining their proficiency, cycling them through workups and deployments and shore rotations. That is a continuous and expensive undertaking that does not pause when a budget review is underway. The carrier air wing assigned to a Ford-class ship typically includes F/A-18E and F/A-18F Super Hornets for strike and fleet air defense, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, F-35C Lightning IIs for stealth strike and advanced strike and advanced sensing, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, C-2A Greyhounds or CMV, 22B Ospreys for carrier onboard delivery, and MH-60 Seahawk helicopters for anti-submarine, warfare and search and rescue. Each of those aircraft represents a separate training pipeline, a separate maintenance community, a separate parts supply chain. The F-35C integration story is particularly relevant to the Ford-class review. The F-35C was specifically designed for the catapult launch and arrested recovery cycle of US carriers. Its stealth capability, its sensor fusion, and its data link architecture make it a different class of aircraft from the Super Hornet for certain missions. particularly penetrating strike against defended targets and the early stages of a contested air campaign where opposing air defences are still intact. If the Navy is considering a Nimitz derivative approach for future hulls, the compatibility of F-35C with the C-13 steam catapult system is not a problem. The aircraft has been tested and certified for steam launch. But the EMALS launch profile is gentler on the airframe, which matters over the aircraft's service life. The obstacle that sits between the review's findings and any actual change to the program is the shipbuilding industrial base. Newport News Shipbuilding has tooled up for the Ford class. The supply chains for EMALS and AAG components are specific to that design. General Atomics has invested in production infrastructure. Any decision to shift to a modified design or a different approach for CVN 8.2 does not take effect immediately. It requires replanning, potentially retooling, and a lead time measured in years before the first keel plate changes. That is the friction in the system. The review can identify that a different approach might be more cost-effective per unit of capability. The industrial machinery of actually building aircraft carriers runs on a much longer cycle than the policy cycle. Decisions made in 2026 about CVN 8.2 will shape what sails into the Western Pacific in the late 2030s or early 2040s. Getting those decisions right matters enormously. The strategic implications of where the Navy lands on this review extend beyond the carrier program itself, because the carrier is the organizing principle of American power projection. 11 nuclear-powered carriers are not just ships. They are the mobile airfields that allow the United States to bring strike aviation to any ocean on the planet without relying on access to allied bases that may not be available in a crisis. In a scenario where China moves against Taiwan and the regional alliance structure is under stress, the question of how many carriers can reach the theatre and how quickly they can generate sorties in the face of a mature anti-access environment is not abstract. It is the operational planning problem that every INDOPACOM wargame has to solve. The distributed lethality architecture that some planners favour as an alternative to carrier-centric power projection. More submarines with Tomahawk Block V anti-ship missiles, more Arleigh Burke destroyers with long-range strike capability, more unmanned surface and undersea vehicles that can operate inside the threat radius that the carrier must avoid, has genuine merits. Submarines are extremely hard to find and kill. Arleigh Burke destroyers with Tomahawk are capable of independent long-range strike. Distributed platforms complicate an adversary's targeting problem in ways that a concentrated carrier strike group does not. But distributed lethality also has limits that the review implicitly acknowledges. Submarines carry a finite number of Tomahawks and have to return to port or a tender to reload. Destroyers are vulnerable to the same anti-ship missiles that threaten carriers without the carrier's defensive aircraft and aviation-based early warning. Unmanned systems are maturing but are not yet ready to substitute for the integrated combat power of a carrier air wing in a high-end conflict. The carrier is not obsolete. It is expensive. Those are different problems with different solutions. What we are watching in June 2026 is not the end of the aircraft carrier era. We are watching the US Navy work through the mid-life adjustment that every dominant weapons platform eventually requires. The moment when the strategic environment has changed enough that the original design assumptions need to be revisited, and the budget math gets hard enough that revisiting them is unavoidable. Comment here if you think the Navy should stay committed to the Ford class and trust that the investment will pay off, or if you think the distributed approach is the smarter bet for the Pacific threat environment as it actually exists in 2026. This is one of those debates where the answer genuinely matters and where reasonable people with good data reach different conclusions. There is one more dimension to the review that does not get enough attention: the allied dimension. The United States does not operate its carriers alone. A carrier strike group deploys with allied warships integrated into the formation. Japanese maritime self-defense force, destroyers, Australian frigates, British destroyers in some configurations. Allied nations observe US carrier operations, train alongside them, and make their own procurement decisions partly on the basis of what the US carrier force looks like and how it operates. Japan has recently commissioned its own converted carriers. The JS Izumo and JS Kaga, modified to operate F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing aircraft, making them the first Japanese fixed-wing capable carrier aviation since World War II. Australia is investing heavily in its surface combatant force. South Korea is building its own light carrier program. These allied investments are calibrated to complement, not duplicate, US carrier capability. If the US review leads to a visible change in the carrier program, whether a modified Ford derivative or a slower build rate, Allied defence planners will notice. The signal that a $13 billion hull is under scrutiny has implications for how allies assess the durability of the US power projection commitment in the Pacific. This is not a reason to keep building ships that do not make sense, but it is a factor that belongs in any honest accounting of what the review's recommendations will cost beyond the direct budget line. The commissioning timeline across the US fleet. spread across decades, with gaps between major hull types as the industrial base works through each design generation, shows how long the lead times are for carrier recapitalization. Decisions made now will be visible in the fleet composition of the 2040s and 2050s. The Chinese shipbuilding rate, which has added major surface combatants at a pace that the US cannot match in raw numbers, will continue regardless of what Washington decides about CVN 82. Here is the turn that the review itself represents. The loop closes here. The Navy is questioning the Ford-class mid-deployment, not because it is broken. The Gerald R. Ford herself completed a successful deployment in 2023. USS John F. Kennedy, commissioned in 2024 and is working through its own workup cycle. The electromagnetic systems are maturing. The crews have figured out how to operate these ships in ways that early critics said was impossible. On operational terms, the Ford class is delivering. The review is happening because $13 billion is a number that cannot be insulated from strategic reality indefinitely. When the DF-26 can hold a carrier at risk from 4,000 kilometers, the return on that $13 billion investment depends on factors that the original program design did not fully account for. Not because the designers were negligent. They were working with the threat environment that existed when they made their choices, but because the world has moved. What the Navy is really doing in June 2026 is what any serious institution has to do periodically. Go back to the assumptions, test them against current conditions, and ask whether the plan still makes sense. That is not weakness. In a competition where the adversary is building fast, building cheap, and building toward the specific vulnerabilities of your most expensive assets, it is the only responsible thing to do. The review's findings will not be fully public for some time. The actual decision on CVN 82's design standard will go through years of internal debate, congressional authorization, and industrial negotiation. But the fact that the review is happening at all, while a strike group sails, tells you something important about where the Navy thinks the pressure is, not on operational execution, which is solid, but on the economic and strategic framework that determines which ships to build, how many to build, and how much to pay for each one. So here is where the math stands in June 2026. 1 Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, $13 billion, EMALS, AAG, advanced weapons elevators, designed for 160 sorties per day, carrying an air wing that includes F-35C, F/A-18 Super Hornet, and EA-18G Growler. The most capable carrier aviation platform ever built. 1 Nimitz-class supercarrier, roughly $8.5 billion in then-year dollars, steam catapults proven over 5 decades, 120 sustained sorties per day, carrying the same aircraft types with the exception of some EMALS-specific optimizations. Reliable, well understood, and capable of every mission the Navy actually needs to execute. The difference, $4+ billion per hull. At a time when the Western Pacific threat environment compresses the carrier's operational freedom, when the industrial base is strained, and when every defense dollar is competing against submarines, destroyers, interceptor stocks, and the unmanned systems that may define the next phase of naval competition. One detail that keeps nagging at me when I look at the full picture. The Ford class's EMALS advantage matters most in high sortie sustained operations. Exactly the kind of operations that a mature DF-26 threat makes harder to sustain. The two factors are working against each other in the specific threat environment where the premium is supposed to matter most. The open question is this: does the Navy bank on the Ford-class premium paying off as defensive systems improve and operational concepts evolve to manage the missile threat? Or does it take the $4 billion difference per hull and invest it in the distributed architecture that makes any single hull less critical to the outcome? Both bets carry real risk. The carrier-centric bet risks paying a premium for a capability that threat compression prevents from being fully used. The distributed bet risks giving up the integrated combat power that only a carrier air wing can provide at exactly the moment when maintaining decisive overmatch matters most. Will you weight the Ford-class premium against the DF-26 threat environment? Or do you think the distributed approach is the smarter bet for the Pacific as it exists today? Drop your answer in the comments. Every response actually gets read. The review's actual findings, when they come out, are going to answer some of these questions and raise new ones about where the most powerful naval force in history puts its money next. We will be here when that happens.